Ask it.
Ask it.
Ask it.
Ask it.
Ask it.
Welcome to the Ask It podcast. The Ask It podcast encourages talking about talking, facilitates your own inner wisdom, and rather than providing answers, considers good questions. So, welcome, wise ones, to today's Ask It question. Today we're talking to James Hawes, who's a psychotherapist and has written this brilliant book, Secret Lives of Men. And today's Ask It question is, what is hidden in the secret lives of men? So, James, welcome. Thank you for giving us your time today.
Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. So, can we just start by just generally introducing you to our audience? Who are you? What do you do? And how have you got to being where you are?
Okay, thank you. So my name's James Hawes. I live in Nottingham, and I've been practicing as a counsellor and psychotherapist for the past 17, 18 years. It became apparent very early on in my career, even as I was training, sitting in a room with generally populated by women and one or two men, that I became really interested and fascinated in men and their kind of emotional health, and indeed my own emotional health. And so fairly early on, I began thinking a lot about men, masculinity, and emotions, and immediately kind of set up this community kind of charity called Men at Work, where we were trying to do two things. Well, one main thing, really trying to help men to dig deeper and to learn to express and become more emotionally healthy ultimately. So we set up a men's group, which I'm still part of a men's group, and it was a really important part of my kind of growth. And also a Shout is an anger management, anger awareness course for men in the community. And since then, I've I've specialised in working with boys and men, and that's kind of where the book has come out of, from all of that experience with boys and men.
Yeah, and great book. I mean, I haven't read every single page, but I've read the majority of it. And I will confess, actually, James, I started out thinking, we might rub each other up the wrong way here, because the first thing that stood out when I read the first half of the book was that you're challenging gender stereotypes. Nothing wrong with that at all. But I did wonder, I thought, is this going to be like, very heavily political because of the current, what I'm saying, the current feeling out there. And then actually, as I got into it, it was absolutely fascinating. And I've got loads of questions and points marked, as you can see. But we probably
lovely to see.
No, it's great, because I want to go back on something that you just said. Actually, we know in our therapy trainings that it's always majority, or 9 times out of 10, majority female. And I often wonder, when I'm working, I have two grown-up sons, so it's not like I'm foreign to the world.
Sure.
But I often think in my own therapy, particularly with young guys, what am I able to bring and what am I doing? And there's a lot that happens in the transference as mother or grandmother or whatever it might be. Also, what might I not be understanding, because I am a woman and I'm a middle-aged woman, and what might they get from men? And I know, as a service provider, I'm always really excited when I have men apply for the training, or indeed apply to be a counsellor in our service, because it is so overwhelmingly populated with women and middle-aged women.
Yes.
So really, really keen to talk to somebody like you. And the other thing that we do at our clinic is we do have a men's group, and I've sent a number of my patients to the men's group, and it's been absolutely fantastic for them. It's opened up a whole new world, particularly around trust and what it's like to sit in a group of men from all different backgrounds. They have found that it really has been a lifeline to some of them. And at the moment we're trying to open that up specifically to young men. So, you know, men maybe still in the latter part of education, things like that. I think it's very, very needed. So, you know, thank goodness for you and the work that you're doing. So we kind of agreed that we'd just see where we go today with this general question that we're looking at, the hidden in the secret lives of men. But I guess what might be a good opening point is to look at your 10 keys, because that's really the latter half of your book, isn't it? Is looking at the 10 keys. And I'll put them up in the info at the end of this podcast, but I'll just read them out really quickly now so we can orient each other. So, number 1, feelings are like a foreign language. Number 2, men often feel the need to constantly prove their masculinity. Number 3, shame is the silent terror. 4, size really does matter. 5, he longs to be looked after and so does she. 6, men's vulnerable feelings are expressed through anger. 7, men's intimate feelings are often expressed through sex. Men's self-esteem is based on performance. 9, action is a man's typical communication style. And 10, men long to be in the company of other men. So, I don't suppose we necessarily need to go through them chronologically unless you want to, but where would you like to dive in?
Well, I really don't mind. Maybe it would be good to start with the first one, because I think that is one of the key parts of my work. Feelings are like a foreign language. For me, that's really core to the work that I do with men.
Okay, right. So over to you. What would you like to say about that?
Well, okay. So, I mean, I think that where I'm coming from is that I tend to think that in terms of the way that men have made, so in the second part of the book, there's 3 parts of the book. The second part of the book is really trying to describe how men are made. So this idea of how we've nurtured men, and I ultimately believe, and through my work and through my research, that men are ultimately traumatized through emotional restriction. So we have taught little boys very early on, almost from day one, but certainly as they grow older, 3, 4, up to 7, that actually we need to start to hide or to suppress certain emotions. So the language like big boys don't cry. You know, boys hear that early on. So right away, what the lesson they're learning is that when I feel pain, I must not show it. So I must suck it down. And that to me is traumatizing. So if we're teaching boys that at a very early age, and they learn it perhaps at home, they will definitely learn it on the playground, because if they fall over and they hurt themselves, they will have learned very early on that if I show emotion, if I start to cry, I'm going to be teased, mocked, called a girl, a sissy, a wuss, all those kind of things. And interestingly, just as I've said those words, what's fascinating is that they are shamed by being called the opposite sex. So often boys and men are put down. The words that they use to mock them and shame them are from the opposite sex, or the genitalia of the opposite sex. And so shame is right there very early on. So if that is true, then what happened to boys is that I suppose I kind of, and this comes up a bit in the anger bit, that men are left with just the default emotion of anger. and they have to squeeze all their emotions through anger, and the vulnerable emotions, classically, like sadness, anxiety, shame, hurt, disappointment, all those kind of things, they are squeezed through anger because that's all we've got, you know. So the way that I kind of, what's really important to me is I think when we work with boys and men, we almost have to help them, almost retrain them in developing an ability to express a broad range of emotions. So there is a term called Alexothemia, which means, and a psychiatrist came up with this term, saying that without words, it means without words for emotion. So, and I think often men don't. So I very rarely ask a man how he feels, because I can fairly well tell you that he's going to come out with 6 words: okay, not bad, fine, all right, normal. And all of those words belong into the kind of happy or content. I should always be okay. That's what's expected of me, and that's the mask. That's I'm always all right. You know, I don't need any help. Don't ask help. So, so for me, that we've learned a lesson that actually I should not be asked for help. And I think, having said that, one of the key things that restricts men, one of the lessons we've taught, is that men, of course women have this as well, men should be self-reliant. I should just find everything I need within myself. I should not ask for help, because that kind of communicates weakness. So the idea of, oh, okay, I need to develop emotional fitness, for me, has become very important. Now, just let me say, I know I'm waffling on a bit, but just let me just say, emotional fitness, what it means to me is when we are able to feel and express the right feeling at the right time in the right way and to the right person. Now, if we don't have a good connection with our feelings, we're unlikely to be able to do that. So in that chapter, I outline kind of my AWARE program, which is the kind of the emotional fitness program. So the kind of stages and steps that would be useful to be able to help us to become emotionally fit. And I'm very keen on bringing a parity between physical and emotional fitness. So when I'm working in school, when I'm working with men, when I'm working with couples, for me, it's really important to say, okay, most of us know what it means to be physically fit. We may not be physically fit, but we know the components. Few of us know the components of what it means to be emotionally fit.
Yeah. And, you know, wouldn't it be really helpful if this was being taught in schools? And I know some schools do, you know, have their PHSE or whatever they call it, and they do look at relationship and emotional well-being, but really in a very surface way. You know, if only we gave this kind of subject the attention that maths gets or whatever, you know, it really does need to be taken a lot more seriously. And I thought you did in your book, you've got these wonderful little diagrams I just kind of put up here, where you start to begin to talk about those things, and then you go on to show how they're often distributed and not equally balanced, etc. So like this kind of thing. I mean, that's what you're talking about, isn't it? Predominantly angry. I thought it's just such a simple visual, but really so useful and helpful.
Yeah, thank you.
I wonder if we can move from that into, so if men aren't able or don't have the language to express their deeper emotions, and even if they did feel like they can't because of the stereotype, you know, I must be strong, must be independent, you know, stiff upper lip, all of that stuff. Then that leads us really into a subject that is very much on my concern at the moment because of the way things are out in the world, which is suicide risk and the growth in depression. Because you gave some excellent statistics. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to put my hand on it now, so I won't try it, but I've got it marked out in your book. You were saying, I think from memory, in the Afghanistan war, 500 plus were killed. In the Iraqi war, I think it was 100 plus. And yet each year we're losing 5,000 men to suicide or death by their own hand. And that is a really stark comparison that you're painting there. You know, so what would you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of what you say, I suppose in that context, it feels like, you know, suicide is a national shame. You know, that we're created as a society, and we're not given men, and of course women are committing suicide as well. We've not given them the tools or the ability or the way, the community, to be able to feel that actually that it's worth living. Life is worth living. So I think it's a national shame, and we don't talk about it. We do, because it's shaming. And we don't do anything about it. Very little in society. There's lots of organisations out there are trying to do more. But I do think, you know, in terms of men, in terms of suicide, that they tend to go for more the harsher ways, and in terms of the hanging or the shooting, the jump,
popular,
that kind of stuff. So that's really brutal. It's, you know, and I think, you know, what have we been teaching boys and men about? Number one, about violence, but also about, you know, how they manage, and this comes into that first chapter really, how they manage difficult emotions. Now, I suppose the way I tend to work with men is that I think it comes into self-reliance ultimately again, that if men have not got a broad emotional spectrum, and they're reliant on the ways of managing themselves. So I think what we've done, and of course, whenever I say men, I know that some women are like this, and I know that not all men are like this. But generally, I think a lot of us as men, we develop external comforters or soothers. So we get our needs met, or we look after ourselves when we've got we're handling difficult emotions through something outside. Now those things might be sex, porn, gambling, substances, alcohol, overworking, successful working. So that gambling. So we're going out and we're saying, okay, to help me avoid uncomfortable feelings, I'm going to do this thing. I'm going to use that to take my mind off it, as it were, for a moment. And of course, what it leads to is unhealthy things. So we've learned to do that and not manage healthy emotions. When men get into really difficult places, what are they going to do? They're going to move towards an external action. And I think that is where men go to suicide. Okay, I can't access, I can't touch, I can't feel that really difficult feeling. It's too painful to feel. So I'm going to ultimately destroy myself. The other part of that, I think, in terms of suicide, and I mentioned this in terms of men and self-harm. Now, we often talk, when we talk about self-harm, you know, often it's been classically, you know, girls cutting themselves, or, you know, we could talk about eating disorders, all kind of stuff like that. Men, you know, I think boys punching walls, risky behavior, doing all, you know, lots of men die early in car accidents or stuff like that. So it's always external, and I think this sense as well. If we've not been given boys and men the capacity to kind of feel difficult emotions and stay with them, then that is kind of where they're going to go. And that's why I think, you know, it's in what we're teaching boys and men in society about emotions is really important. So it comes back to, we need to, as you were saying earlier, you know, can this be education? This is an important part of education, like empathy is. But I was going to say, just in terms of, if we internalize anger, you know, and again, some people would say when we internalize anger, you know, we're turning anger in on ourselves. We might be verbally beating up ourselves and putting ourselves down. That is a real bad an unhealthy kind of way of dealing with emotions, you could say it's self-harm. It's psychological self-harm. And again, if we're constantly giving ourselves a hard time, which I would say is kind of toxic shame, then we're going to just go to that. You can see how easy it could be to go to kind of external comforters or some kind of self-harm and possibly suicide.
Yeah, there's so many thoughts come up in my mind listening to what you're saying. Firstly, I was thinking of a young lad I worked with in hospital who had all sorts of violent fantasies and things like that. And he would channel his anger through rugby. And it would either be expressed to others or himself. If it was expressed to others, he'd go in for the hard tackle and love it if he heard a bone snap and, real vicious stuff. And if he wanted to harm himself, he would pick a fight. So that's like a real macho way of wading in. Actually, what it was about was punishing self.
Yes.
So quite a complex issue, really.
Yeah, and I mean, just to cut in there, I think it's a fascinating thing, and I may have mentioned it in my book. I think I do, but almost what we've done to boys and men in terms of rugby is the classic one. It's a combative sport. We're sanctioned violence ultimately. But it's rugby. I was talking to a young client yesterday, and we were kind of laughing together about this because I think it's a fascinating thing. I've never really played rugby, but when you watch rugby, you got these massive big men. They're hard, they're impenetrable. They're huge, and they're basically rolling around in mud. They're grabbing each other, touching, all this contact, putting their hands between their legs and holding. It's all very erotic, really, but it's done in a kind of, we're really tough. This is hard stuff. And it's fascinating, really, in terms of, okay, this is fine. You can do that, man, because we're sanctioned it in society. It's a bit like, again, football. It's a magic place for a lot of men. Like when the goal is scored, it's almost like all bars off. You'll see men express their full range of emotions in a football. They'll be happy. You'll see men smiling more than anywhere else. When the goal is scored, they can dance, they can kiss, they can hug, they can jump on each other. They can do all of that. Nobody in that crowd, not one big macho man, is ever going to say, "Oi, you're gay." They don't. It doesn't matter at that moment. It doesn't matter, and I think that this sanctioning of culturally sanctioning is fascinating in terms of what we say. Okay, men, you can behave in that way in those particular scenarios.
Yeah, absolutely, and as you point out in your book, and you spend a lot of time looking at, shame is the core here. And how we all manage that. And of course, we all feel that. And you talk about healthy shame and unhealthy shame. So could you kind of open up and expand upon that for us?
Yes, interesting. I was just having a conversation on a Facebook group today about that. And I think when I was writing the book, I was doing quite a lot of research and thinking about shame quite a lot because it was coming up more and more with the work that I do with men. And it's absolutely, I think, core. And as it happens, I'm starting a workshop next week called Men, Shame and Intimacy. So I think it's a fascinating thing. And I was never sure about, and as we were talking this morning on this group, there was a really worried about, is there such a thing as healthy shame? And people saying, and I've read, Brené Brown, who's done a lot of research on shame, and I think her book's brilliant. I thought it was only me, but it isn't. And I think Brené, she doesn't find any sense of a healthy shame. Where another writer I've read and I really admire is Carla McLaren, and she's the language of emotions. And the way she talks about emotions is, in my view, phenomenal. It's amazing. I love it. And she explores shame in quite a deep way. And it was from her work, really, that I started to think more around healthy shame. And so what she would say is, yes, there is a healthy shame. And what it is about, it's about internal boundaries. So when we cross or break an internal boundary, you could say a value or a moral, then shame is going to make itself known. It's going to say, hold on, you've broken that you've gone against your own value. And so you, therefore, in that understanding, you should feel shame because you've crossed your boundary. And so, you know, in old language, it was more like consciousness, I suppose. And I think that's really, so for me, I think that makes a lot of sense to me, that yes, I should, they should, because, you know, there are people in society who are shameless. They don't have enough shame. They don't have any sense of internal boundary, what could be appropriate or not appropriate, because they've not got enough shame. And again, when you put it in that idea of a shameless, you know, a lacking of empathy, if you like, the narcissist, then I think that's a really interesting. So you could say that, you know, for me, that's why I think there is healthy shame. But unhealthy shame or toxic shame is a shame, is a rule that comes from the other, from outside, from a culture, from a parent, from another person who's basically saying, you are wrong when you do that or when you think that. Now, that to me is unhealthy. It's toxic. I know a lot about that. I've lived under that for many, many years, as I think many people have done. And we're shamed because of our life, our thinking, our beliefs, our views. And we're made to, you know, those words of shoulds, oughts, musts, you know, where you shouldn't do that, you shouldn't behave in that way. That to me is all toxic and unhealthy. And that's where we get kind of, we start to lose congruence, I think. We start to split internally, thinking, oh, they think I shouldn't be like that, but my internal kind of boundaries are saying that's absolutely fine. So that's where the battle comes, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. We've done a podcast when myself and my colleague were going to be doing some CPD around shame. And so we did a podcast of the two of us thinking about that and the subtle differences between shame and guilt. And where, excuse me, where I might overlap with the healthy shame is, I think, I agree. If you don't feel shame, I think healthy shame helps you navigate what is socially acceptable, social boundaries, how to fit into society. And I think absolutely, if you don't have a sense of that, then you're one down, really. You're on the back foot. So I can kind of understand what you mean by healthy shame, although I might language that differently. And I agree. I think unhealthy shame is we make this definition between guilt being when you've done a thing that feels bad or wrong or goes against your code or social code. But when you feel shame, it feels like all of you is bad, like you're some awful, contorted, distorted alien being outside of the norm. And we, of course, everybody, you could stop everybody in the street or most people in the street and say, you know, do you know what shame is? And we'll all have our own experience of that. So in that regard, it's not particular to men, of course not. But it's the way that that's manifested. And you again link that to anger being an obvious expression of deeply held shame. And you also pick up on not taking responsibility as a man. You kind of link that with shame. So can you unpack that a bit? What if we're thinking, so to go back to where you started, you're thinking and a lot of your work is about men in relationships, you know, how do they express their emotions, how do they manage intimacy, so how does anger and shame and not taking responsibility, how does that feed into relationships? What would you say about that?
Yeah, I think in the book I'm really interested in the relationship between rage and shame. So in the anger chapter, I'm kind of breaking anger down into kind of 5 different states, so, or styles, if you like. So there will be the aggressive, there'll be the passive, internal shame, there'll be the passive aggressive, the subtle, the hidden ways of expressing anger, and there's rage. And they're the kind of 4, I'd say, unhealthy ways of expressing anger. Healthy anger would be more in terms of the assertives. Now, when we as men feel shame, and I think in exploring shame with men, I think our men's and women's experience of shame in terms of gender is really, really quite different. And so the way I explore it with men is that there is a gender shaming. I think for women there is not so much a gender shaming, but there's a role shaming. So women tend to be shamed if they, in terms of about being their mother, if they are a mother, how they mother, their beauty, the way they express themselves. So it's more about their role and how society judges them in terms of from being a woman. So but whereas men, I think we're shamed for not being the right kind of man. So we have this whole idea of the real man discourse, that the idea that actually there is a way of being a man, and if you don't fit into that, then you're less than a man, and you're going to be gender shamed. And ultimately, as we started out, the way that we shame men is kind of just say, well, you're more like a woman, and we even use that. So in a workshop, I've asked men, what does it mean to be a man? And they will say, some will come back and say, not to be a woman. Now, this is a really kind of fascinating stuff. It's like, well, okay, so the main thing about being a man is not to in any way show any femininity, which may then obviously connect with kind of emotional expression.
Yeah.
So there's that. But coming back to the idea of, when we feel shame, an external shame, it's one of those feelings or emotions that kind of diminishes us. So we feel quite small. Our body goes small. We may want to disappear. We may feel we want to feel invisible. We want to get out. And what happens often is that if we're caught in the trap, or we're in that shame moment where another person, male perhaps, has shamed us, and there's a group of people watching, or even absolutely in the intimate relationship where a man may feel shamed by a woman, patronized, belittled, put down, or whatever it is, there's a quick connection moving to rage. So rage, you could see, is this dynamic, massive, big emotion, anger. So we flip from the small to the big very quickly.
Yeah.
100%. And for me, that's a cover. That's I cannot feel shame. It's way too painful. So now we're kind of saying, look how big I am. Look how powerful I am. And you need to be quiet. You need to go away. You need to know that I'm now back in control of this situation. And for me, that's a real difficulty in terms of how men are going to express their emotions. And I think that often, unfortunately, plays out. Most of the men I work with in terms of rage, they express their rage to their intimates, often to their partners, often to their wives.
So how do we get from there to this idea of not taking responsibility in relationships?
Yeah, so I think for me, when I talk about men, I say, look, okay, what's the difference between And I've got some teenage boys, and one of them says, "Well, that's not fair." But but I say, "What's the difference between a boy and a man?" So what I mean about a boy and a man is a psychological boy and a man. So I would kind of say, look, there are a lot of male kidults running around in society, and because they have not made that growth move to responsibility, and so what I mean when a man can psychologically become a man is that when he can take responsibility for his language, for his words and his actions and his behavior. So he is actually saying, okay, when I express something, I've got to take responsibility for that. And I'm not going to blame anybody else. It's that classic thing in anger, isn't it? Like, you made me angry. Now, in all my anger courses, I'll say, well, no one made you angry. Nobody made you anything. You made you angry, and you've got to take responsibility for that.
Yeah. Okay. And so moving from relationship and taking responsibility in relationship and what we might expect of the other, etc. What I wanted to move into was how men distort intimacy. And of course, women do this as well, but we are talking in stereotypes and we are looking at this through men's eyes. But men's most comfortable way of being intimate with a sexual other is through sex.
Yeah.
So I wanted to open up talking about men and sex, particularly men and pornography, because it's so big now in our culture and so accessible for younger and younger ages. And of course, with a lot of that happening online and kind of virtual relationships, I think this is another area where young men are really not understanding what it is to be in a realistic relationship with another person. So I'd like to understand your views and your comments on that area.
Yeah, I think it comes back to somewhere along the line the idea of external soothers. So when you said, okay, how do men express intimacy? I think what we've taught boys and men is through sex. So sex equals intimacy. Now, it is a tragedy for relationships and for men if that is true, because ultimately, kind of as I highlight in the book, if that is true, then it means that we can only have and show intimacy to people who we can have sex with. And so that if that is true, that for a heterosexual man, he can't have intimacy with another man. And so we've kind of focused this idea of intimacy into a physical genitalia kind of place. And that's a tragedy. And because I think we're missing out on so much connection with men. And so classically, and I think this again, coming back to suicide, this is part of the problem. I think men are nearly always psychologically isolated and often physically isolated. And what I mean by psychological isolation is that a man could have a best mate for 20, 25 years. He may spend every weekend with him under the bonnet of a car, fishing or watching football or playing football. And not once in those 25 years has he said to him, Tom, I really like being with you. Or Tom, do you know what? I think I love you. Yeah. So there's no expression. And so Tom, for those 25 years, and he maybe haven't taken responsibility to express himself as neither, he really doesn't know. And it's a bit like often in heterosexual relationships or even gay relationships, this sense of if we don't express ourselves, so often nobody knows. So women can be in partnership with men for 20 years or more. And I know this, that many women are wondering, I have no idea what he thinks. I don't know if he really loves me. He never says it. He never says anything tender, or he never gives any vulnerability. I don't even actually know who he is. I'm living with a stranger. You know, and this is where the kind of idea of the book came from, you know, The Secret Lives of Men. Who is he? And that's a tragedy in terms of relationship. And for men, that we're having to hide, we're having to keep ourselves well hidden. And ultimately that comes back to shame. You know, the idea of fear that if I was to expose myself and go, so intimacy ultimately is, if we're going to be intimate, it means exposure. It means vulnerability. Dare I share my truth? Dare I share something really tender and beautiful with the other, with the female, with the male, with the son, with the daughter? Dare I do that? And you know, and often men don't, and that's why it's kind of a tragedy when we talk about, in terms of relationships and growthful relationships, relationally fit relationships, and again, it ultimately comes back to some of the messages that we've learned around emotions and also around sex. What I just add a bit here. What I'm really interested in exploring, what has happened. When did this happen for boys in terms of the disconnection of intimacy with the other, and it turned into sex? And you've mentioned pornography, and I think there's no doubt that what boys are learning very early on, and earlier, and you know, they're talking about that boys by the age of 18 will have consumed literally thousands of images of pornography. What does that mean to intimacy and to relationships? But I kind of, when I started thinking about this, I was kind of started to explore what I called the intimacy break. So this idea that around the idea of puberty for boys, that boys started to, they become more sexually aware and active, and their minds and are full of maybe sexual thoughts. They're getting what's the game thing? No, phalluses, you know, erections, you know, commonly all the time. It becomes quite embarrassing and shaming, and so they're kind of, it's a really confusing state for them. And then they're connecting with, they're seeing images of women online, they're seeing pornography, there's the language with their mates, the way they're talking about women. And so, you know, you can imagine a boy, 12, 13, is thinking, okay, you know, his image of mum is like, well, mum's mum. You know, mum's always there. She's lovely. She's tender. She's always able to listen to me. I'm stereotyping here. Yeah. You know, she's going to be available, and I feel really safe with mum. So he's got that image, and the intimacy break is now he's hearing that. Hold on, I'm now hearing that women are sexual objects, that we should want to have sex with them, and so this is a really confusing thing. And it might also be that he finds himself feeling attracted to his mum. He might hear his mate saying, God, you know, your mum, wow, you know, I'd really like to, you know, and there's all this issue. So this language, this understanding about, oh, are women, so women are sex objects. And that's the break. And I think that, for me, is a really important thing that goes on in society. And I don't think it has to be that way. And I think, but, you know, the sexualization of kind of society, and then you know, when you start looking, and as I was exploring, you know, in terms of boys being in terms of pedophilia, in terms of prostitutes, in terms of now we've got sex robots coming on, you know, and it's all kind of frightening when you think, oh my God, men are almost totally almost could be addicted to sex. And I think, again, it becomes so out there that it becomes that external soother. That is the way that I can have some kind of intimacy. And actually, I would say, look, pornography, when boys watch pornography, there's no intimacy there. This is purely mechanicalization of sex, close-ups of vagina, genitalia, and stuff. There's nothing intimate. This is mechanical, and so it's an abuse, and it's of love, of tenderness, of warmth, of relationship. And so, like you, I'm really kind of concerned about what is happening. When we do know, and I'm sure it's true for you, that I see quite a lot of young men, and we know this is on the rise, who are having sexual dysfunctional issues. They're finding it difficult to get erections, to climax, and all sorts of things. And there's definitely a link to the idea of the apps of Tinder and all that kind of stuff, where it's almost like, this is all about sex. No relation. We're not bothered about relationship, and it leaves an emptiness and a loneliness, and I think a tragedy ultimately.
Yeah, and what astounds me is when I have, men who are my sort of age sitting in my therapy room, and they're talking about their relationships, and I'll say to them as standard, well, do you talk about this, and what's your wife's view? And they can have been with someone for 25, 35, 40 years, never had any conversation. I find it astounding, absolutely astounding. And everything has been whittled down, as you say, to these very graphic sexual images in front of you on a screen. And so you're not thinking about the sensuousness of touch, how we communicate through touch, the kissing, all of that stuff. It's literally about vagina meeting penis, or whatever it happens to be, penis meeting whatever it needs to meet.
That's right.
And absolutely nothing about how we work up to that. And I think it actually works mentally to both genders, really, in that my son was saying now that young men feel they've got to tick all these boxes, particularly physically, before they even get off the starting block if they want to date somebody. And young women tend to be much more sexually aggressive than my peers would have been when we were young people. So I think it's and of course women watch pornography as well, but I think it has we can't just say, oh, this has had a very detrimental effect on men in terms of relationship. I think it's also had a very detrimental impact on young women as well, how they think they've got to be like these live sex dolls or robots, as you say.
Absolutely. Yeah. The other things that I'm really is important to me is in terms of, I suppose, grow. How do men grow? How do they move from what we're kind of been describing in terms of maybe the emotional, lack of emotional fitness, or this shame, or then we've been talking about intimacy, and I suppose, again, what we touched on earlier, for me, there is no doubt that the idea of men having the courage to come to therapy, or even more the courage to enter a men's group, is a massive part of growth. Men's groups in particular, I think, I often say, look, when men come together in a group, there is a real possibility of de-shaming. So the idea of normalizing. So if men have often, as I said earlier, they're kind of often psychologically isolated. They don't talk to other men. Of course, some do, and I've heard this many times before. But if they have not talked to other men about how they feel, that is a real lead into shame. And men's groups are ultimately about, okay, let's share about what's going on for me, and share some vulnerability. And what I've discovered in those groups, that men are absolutely quite capable of doing that, and it's contagious. And men can come out of those groups feeling absolutely relieved, but as I'd say, de-shamed, i.e., I'm not the only one. This isn't just me. And that is brilliant. And that's I think can be the growth. That can be the move away from, oh, it is okay to have these thoughts. Oh, that Jack, he thinks that, or he's had those thoughts like I have, and there's a lot of commonalities in terms of what we hold in, and this is not just men. When we're able to intimately talk to anybody, women or partners, about feelings. Oh, we all hold those feelings, and this is the trap, isn't it? The kind of emotional trap that we all live in. We keep silent. We don't talk about stuff because we think we're going to be shamed. So the de-shaming of group work, especially, I think, is massively important.
Yeah, and there were two things that stuck out, again linking to shame, but what I think can be really worked through well in a group is this idea of the confusion that there is between being strong. 9 times out of 10, if I ask women what men are, strength will come into it. So this idea of being strong, and if you're not strong, then you're vulnerable, and vulnerability equals weak. And of course, It doesn't. And I think, and also there's a man in my field, let's put it that way, who uses this phrase, kindness equals weakness. And I was really interested because you've got that in quite a few places in your book as well, where people have said that. And I think those two things can really be worked through in that environment of a men's group. Kindness doesn't equal weakness. Supporting another and being open to another does not equal weakness. And you can be both strong and vulnerable.
No, absolutely. And I think you're right. I mean, I think that another message that boys have heard very early on is to be tough, to be strong. What does it mean to be a man? To be tough, to be strong. And what they mean by strength, ultimately, I think, is perhaps physical, but equally a kind of a psychological strength. Always be in control. Don't let your guard down. And again, that's an emotional trap. An incredibly difficult thing to keep up, and absolutely what you're saying in terms of even about men should be brave. Again, really an emotional trap. What do we mean by that? We mean that men should be putting their lives on the line, or they should be. And actually, most of us don't feel like that. But my view about bravery or courage is psychological. You become. I think most men are terrified, absolutely terrified of vulnerable emotions. And that's why they steer so clear of them. So to be able to express a vulnerable emotion takes huge amount of courage, and that is bravery. That is strength.
And another thing I wanted to touch on, again, linked to shame, which we keep going back to, but we're bound to, because that's the core root of, I think, all of our issues, really, one way or another. I wanted to come to this idea of banter, because I don't really get that. And I hear my son say it a lot to me, oh, it's just banter. But one of my sons was really badly bullied. And when by exclusion, by teaching, not necessarily by teasing, rather, not necessarily by sort of physical bullying, but sort of psychological bullying. I watched him go from an outgoing, bubbly little lad to a very closed, anxious young man.
Mm.
And I feel it stole something from him.
Mm.
So can you talk a bit about banter and what we mean by that? And because the other thing I've noticed, maybe connected with that, maybe not, you'll tell me, but I've noticed often when men get together, I was watching, for example, I was watching a Joe Rogan podcast, and he can be very intelligent, very well informed. He's very popular, and he has excellent debates and discussions, and he's able to talk about his feelings and stuff. With some men, and I know he's a comedian, but with some men, it becomes very juvenile, and then we move into the banter. So,
Yeah.
So I'll hand over to you. What would you say about that?
Yeah, in the book, there's a chapter on communication, and I just explore about what men have learned about communication in terms of body language. I often talk about the nodding and the winking, and all that kind of language, non-spoken stuff. And then I talk about banter being maybe the second form of ways of boys and men learn communication. Now, banter, you could say, was originally a kind of form of toughening up. It's a way of, toughening men. Oh, can you take this? Can you take this? Some kind of psychological battering, as it were. And of course, banter, you could say, is generally passive aggressive. Mostly, it's negative. And so it's subtle. But boys generally learn very early on the language of banter. And in the book, I talk about the 7 rules of banter, but some of these rules are, in terms of what they're not written down. We just know them. And it might be one of the rules might be, well, you banter to your friends. So you're most hateful to your friends, because most of banter is it's all negative. And it's, so you hear boys put each other down again. And it's almost like, they're having to put on an armor just to protect themselves for these arrows that are coming at them. And it is tarring. And this ties in with the idea of where we go with shame. Why don't men share more intimacy? Why don't they share how they feel? Because they've had to negotiate this field of negativity. And you get banter, as you've said, banter come from different levels. There's a spectrum, I think. Myself, I like banter. I mean, I like the quick-wittedness, kind of little throwback. I find it very playful. Now, I'm always careful, and I want to know that what I'm doing is with the other, is that they're happy with it, because I there's nothing in me that wants to hurt them, but I'm aware that people can't do that quick-witted. They may be offended by that, and so I wanted to understand that. But so it can go from the playful banter, let's just have a laugh at the other person's expense, which is what it is, and again, you can see that's all negative, to the right end of the degree, which ultimately turns into bullying. And people can then just, I've heard it with young people and adults, it's like they can be racist, they can be homophobic, they can do whatever, they're sexist, misogynistic. And then if you just end the sentence, it's only banter, it's incredible.
Excuses
that actually,
a lot.
Yeah, well, I'm only doing banter, so I can basically say what the hell I want, but because I'm just going to put that little caveat at the back, it's fine. And you should be able to take banter. Now, if we put that into the world of a boy and a man, and again, that's all that they've learned about communication and about tenderness, it's not surprising that boys struggle to be intimate, to talk about their feelings, because they need to, can I trust this person? Are they going to laugh at me? Are they going to mock me? And this is another one of those kind of gender systems, if you like, that keeps people apart. And that is another system that ultimately kind of, I think it is a system. I think it kind of, this idea that you shall not. We, as a male community, you will not be kind to one another, because we are, a lot of systems or institutions are run on hierarchies, and hierarchies work on a kind of respect for the person above, and that the person above can treat the person below in a kind of bad way. And it's almost like this is how we operate. And so the idea of exposure or being intimate, sharing how I feel, loads of different steps in society says, no, don't do it. And so this produces psychological isolation, which is, again, so we're talking about breaking through all these ways of being. It's immense that men can do it. Look, and when I say men, women, I know women, women are clearly shamed. They have the same kind of thing of the hierarchies and the misogyny and, the patriarchy and all that kind of stuff. So it's all there. And but it's a kind of system or cultures or societies that we've set up that are against intimacy, against kindness, against love, against vulnerability. It's a tragedy.
Yeah, and made even worse by us all being isolated and separated from each other with all of this current crisis going on. Really not helping at all. May or may not be necessary, but it's just compounding those issues and compounding reliance on virtual contact rather than literal contact. It's now harmful to touch each other or breathe the same air as each other and hold each other and be close, and very, very worrying. So if there was one thing that you really wanted to have understood or wanted people to take away from our conversation today, what might that be?
Well, I think the key thing is about developing emotional fitness. For me, that is the key. That is the trick. That is the beautiful thing. And this is for everybody, not just men, but in terms of when we can learn to express the full spectrum of emotions, especially our vulnerable emotions, there is growth. There is love, there is warmth, there is intimacy. And for me, if as a society we can do more of that, there is real hope. For me, it is kind of almost a mission thing that, if we are more psychologically connected, we become more aware of ourselves, we can show and be more empathic to others, there is real possibilities here.
Great. So what's coming up for you, James? What projects have you got lined up, if any?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier, I do a series of workshops online. My next one is on Tuesday, called Man, Shame and Intimacy. That's a kind of 2-hour workshop, but it's 6 hours overall, so it'll be over 3 weeks. I'm also going to do a little one-off 2-hour workshop in March on bullying, and then I think I'm doing my other workshop I think in March as well on successful 7 keys to work with men successfully. But apart from that, I'm beginning to write again, so I'm hoping this year to produce my manual on the Shout program, which is the anger program. So I'm working on that at the moment, and so that will be for practitioners. And I'm also hoping to publish a book on anger, just a smaller book on anger. And also I'm planning to do some online courses with a colleague of mine. So some of those will be anger, but we're going to set up a called Emotional Gym. So we're going to kind of try and run a gym where people can exercise their emotions.
Fantastic. So I'm not sure how quickly we're going to get this podcast out. So if people miss what you've just spoken about, do you regularly run these things over and over? Yeah.
Yeah, on online events, I think there'll be a rolling of this is a rolling kind of program of them. Yeah.
Yeah. And what is the best way for people to see what you've got on offer and to contact you?
They can drop into my website. So I have a couple. So one is jameshawes.org. That's mainly around my book and some workshops I do, and also the other about my therapy work. It's synergycounseling.com.
So there we have it, wise ones. Check out the book. Great for men, women, everybody. The Secret Lives of Men. James Hawes. Really excellent book. Thoroughly recommend it.